Imagine night, fog, and suddenly, from beyond the horizon come the muffled beats of drums. Boats with dragon heads on their prows approach the shore. The villagers hear screams, and fear binds them tighter than any chains. Why did Vikings instill such terror throughout Europe? Was it just about their axes and swords, or was there something more behind it? Their ability to suddenly appear where they were least expected, strange rituals, appearance as if straight from nightmares. All this made them true ghosts from the north. But here's what's most interesting. They created part of this fear themselves, consciously turning their name into a weapon. Want to know exactly how Vikings knew how to frighten people even before battle? Then don't switch channels ahead, is something you definitely didn't expect to hear. Vikings are one of the most mysterious cultures in human history. Fierce warriors of the north, whose raids kept the coasts of Europe in fear for almost 300 years. But what exactly made them so frightening in the eyes of their victims? Let's uncover the secrets of this primal fear that hasn't faded even after 1,000 years. Let's start with the fact that the very word Viking sounded like a death sentence to many inhabitants of early medieval Europe. Where did it come from? In the Old Norse language, there was the expression Vik Bay, or inlet. Man from the bay. One who comes from the sea, that's what it meant. And if you think about it, just this alone instilled terror. An enemy who comes from where there are no roads, suddenly appearing as if from nowhere. But it wasn't just about the name. Vikings masterfully used psychological weapons, and the first such weapon was their unpredictability. Imagine, you live in a small coastal settlement, going about your daily business, and suddenly ships appear on the horizon. You have no army, no fortress walls, not even time to gather your belongings. Vikings could travel up to 180 kilometers per day on their famous Drakkar ships, which made their attacks lightning fast. And their ability to sail up rivers deep into the mainland meant that even those who lived far from the seacoast couldn't feel safe. Just imagine. In the morning, you hear that Vikings have plundered a monastery 50 kilometers from you, and by evening, they're at your door. Such speed of movement seemed supernatural to people of that time. This was a real blitzkrieg of the early Middle Ages. Another factor that turned Vikings into a real nightmare was their appearance. And here's the time to dispel one of the most famous myths. No, Vikings did not wear horned helmets in battle. This image is an invention of much later times. But how they really looked was no less frightening. Imagine hardened northern warriors, many taller than the average European of that time, with long hair and beards, often braided or adorned with beads. Their bodies were covered with tattoos and scars from past battles, and their clothes were often dyed in bright colors, red, blue, purple. But the main thing was their war paint. Before battle, many Vikings applied patterns to their faces and bodies, using blue paint from woad, a plant that gives blue pigment. This tradition had roots in ancient pagan rituals and made them look like demons from nightmares in the eyes of Europe's Christian population. And what do you know about Berserkers? These were elite warriors among the Vikings, whose name can be translated as those dressed in bearskins. Before battle, they entered a special state of combat trance called Berserkergang. Chroniclers describe them as warriors who howled like wild beasts, bit their shields, and were as strong as bears or bulls. They felt no pain, ignored wounds, and fought with incredible fury. Modern scientists suggest that such a state could be achieved through special rituals, possibly including the use of certain plants or mushrooms with psychoactive properties. Imagine the horror of an ordinary person confronted with such an opponent. A warrior who does not fear death, feels no pain, and fights with inhuman strength, a real demon in the flesh. Sound accompaniment also played an important role in the psychological warfare of the Vikings. Before attacking, they often used special instruments to create intimidating noise. One of the most famous is the lure, a long curved trumpet that produced a low humming sound that carried for many kilometers. This sound heralded an attack and instilled terror in the hearts of coastal inhabitants. In addition, Vikings had a tradition of battle cry known as the war cry. Hundreds of warriors simultaneously uttered this cry before the start of battle, creating a wave of sound that literally paralyzed the enemy with fear. Modern historians compare the psychological effect of this technique to the influence of air raid sirens during World War II, a sound that by itself caused panic. And do you know that Vikings deliberately created terrifying legends about themselves? In an era when news spread by word of mouth, reputation was a powerful weapon. The scarier the rumors about you, the more likely your next victim would surrender without a fight. And Vikings masterfully used this. They deliberately committed demonstrative cruelties that were meant to be a warning to everyone else. One such ritual was the infamous Blood Eagle. This was an execution during which the victim's back was cut open, ribs spread apart like wings, and lungs pulled out. There are debates about whether this ritual was actually performed or was just a frightening legend, but what's important is the fact itself. Even just talk of such punishment made people tremble with horror. Another factor that intensified fear of the Vikings was their religion. Vikings were pagans in a predominantly Christian Europe, and their beliefs seemed terrifying to Christians of that time. They worshipped many gods, the main ones being Odin, Thor, and Freya. Particularly frightening were the ideas about Valhalla, the afterlife, where warriors fallen in battle went. According to Viking beliefs, a glorious death in battle was the best fate for a warrior. Valkyries, divine maidens, chose worthy fallen warriors and carried their souls to Valhalla, where they feasted with Odin and prepared for the final battle, Ragnarok. This attitude toward death made them fearless in battle, which further intensified their opponent's horror. How do you fight someone who isn't afraid to die? Viking tactics were also designed to intimidate. Unlike regular armies of that time, which usually avoided attacking religious objects, Vikings deliberately attacked monasteries and churches. This not only gave them rich booty, monasteries often stored valuables, but also inflicted a serious psychological blow on the Christian population. How could you explain to simple believers that God had not protected even his own temples? The plundering of the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 of our era became a shocking event for all of Europe precisely because it seemed unthinkable. An attack on a holy place, the killing of monks, the plundering of relics. This was not just a military attack, but a blow to the very foundations of medieval man's worldview. Interesting fact, Vikings carefully chose the time for their raids, often timing them to Christian holidays when people were busy with church services and least expected an attack. Such calculation further reinforced the impression that Vikings were messengers of the devil, appearing specifically to desecrate holy days. It's worth noting the technological superiority of Vikings, which also added to their frightening aura. Their ships' drakers were a true marvel of shipbuilding of their time. With shallow draft allowing them to approach right up to the shore and sail up rivers, fast and maneuverable, they gave Vikings a huge advantage. For many coastal residents, the sight of a dragon's head on the bow of a ship became the last thing they saw in their lives. And what about weapons? Vikings were famous for their battle axes, but no less frightening were their swords. The blade-making technology, which Vikings called pattern welding, allowed them to create swords of incredible strength and sharpness for that time. On the blades of such swords, one could often see wavy patterns resembling flowing water, the result of multiple forging and folding of metal. Special mention deserves the psychology of the Vikings themselves. For them, raids were not just a way of obtaining loot, it was a way of life, a social elevator, an opportunity to earn fame and respect. A young Viking setting off on his first campaign knew, returning with booty, he would become a full member of society, could marry, would gain the respect of tribesmen. This created a powerful motivation to fight to the end. In addition, Vikings had the concept of droppa a praise song that skalds, poets, composed about the exploits of warriors. To become the hero of such a song was the greatest honor, for which Vikings were ready to perform incredible feats and take risks. For them, glory was more important than life, and this made them fearless in battle, which, again, terrified their opponents. But not everything in the image of Vikings was associated with violence and fear. Paradoxically, many of those who were initially victims of raids subsequently became their trading partners. Vikings were not only warriors, but also skilled traders, craftsmen, explorers. They founded the first cities in Russia, reached the shores of North America 500 years before Columbus, created complex trading networks stretching from Greenland to Baghdad. However, it was the image of the ruthless warrior raider that was imprinted in the memory of generations. Medieval chroniclers, most of whom were monks, naturally emphasized the cruelty and barbarism of those who attacked their monasteries. From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord. This prayer was heard in many churches across Europe for several centuries, and it's not hard to understand why. But let's think. Perhaps the image of the Viking as the embodiment of horror was partly created by their victims themselves. Christian chroniclers describing the raids often demonize the pagan Vikings, presenting them as God's punishment for sins or as messengers of the devil. This image passed from generation to generation, overgrown with new horrifying details. On the other hand, the Vikings themselves seemed to deliberately cultivate their frightening reputation. Their sagas and songs often glorified the exploits of particularly cruel warriors. The fear of the opponent was a tactical advantage for them. Sometimes just a rumor about approaching Vikings was enough for the inhabitants of entire settlements to leave everything and flee. So what's the conclusion? Vikings were indeed frightening warriors, strong, fearless, technologically superior to many of their opponents. But their reputation of horror was also the result of skillful use of psychological weapons, from intimidating appearance and battle cries to the deliberate creation of legends about their cruelty. The Viking Age lasted approximately from the end of the 8th to the middle of the 11th century of our era. During this time, they transformed from scattered tribes into organized kingdoms, adopted Christianity, and gradually merged into European civilization. But the memory of the people from the Bay who terrorized the coasts lives on to this day in legends, books, films, and of course, in our imagination. And now, a question for you. What elements of the Vikings' psychological warfare do you think could be effective even in modern conflicts? Perhaps the ancient warriors knew something about human psychology that is still relevant today. Write your opinion in the comments. I'm really interested in what you think about this. And if you enjoyed this immersion into the dark psychology of Vikings, support the channel with a like and subscription. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next episodes where we'll continue to reveal unexpected aspects of well-known historical cultures. Share this video with friends. Let them also learn what was behind the bone-chilling fear of dragon ships. Next time, we'll embark on a journey through another mysterious civilization, whose culture was no less frightening than that of the Vikings, but at the same time amazingly exquisite and refined. Which one? It's still a secret, but here's a hint. Their rulers considered themselves children of the sun. And remember, sometimes the most terrible weapon is not a sword or an axe, but the fear that lives in our own imagination. Until our next meeting in the world of ancient mysteries.